Hello, hola, buenos días, bon dia. Good morning to everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning in the second day of Sónar+D, first official day of Sónar. As I say every morning, please administer your energies or save your energies or use them carefully because it's still a very intense festival, a very long weekend. And this morning and for the next few hours, actually, we are exploring. We're going on explorations in time and explorations in space. And let me give you just a little bit of context for the session that we're going to start right now and actually for the next couple of hours. As you know, this is the 25th anniversary of Sónar. Was any of you in the first Sónar? I want to see if there was any kind of like explorer or pioneer that was here 25 years ago. Well, actually, as you know, this is the 25th anniversary, and for the 25th anniversary, the festival has celebrated it with a very special project. We asked 40 musicians, friends of the festival, to write a small music piece around 10 seconds long, and these 40 music pieces have been have been broadcasted from a radio telescope in Norway, addressed to an exoplanet that is 12.5 light years from here. It's a planet being in the solar star of Lutein in the Lutein system. It's actually one potentially habitable exoplanet that we chose because it was the one that you could reach more easily broadcasting from the northern hemisphere, because that's the radio telescope that we had access to. And these 40 musicians, friends of the festival, decided what could they say in an 8-second music piece that could potentially have an impact or make sense to a potential civilization that would listen to them in Lutein's star, in Lutein's be 12.5 years from now. And our expectation or our desire, or actually almost in a way the goal of the project, would be that if whoever receives the message wants to respond, it would would arrive here back in other 12.5 years, which make it 25 years, so right in time for Sónar's 50th anniversary. I hope all of us who are here in this room can actually be back in 25 years to know or to be ready to see if we can get those messages back. If you want to know more about the project, it's called the Sónar Calling Project. You can actually know all about it in the Sónar Calling installation, the Sónar Calling control room, which is opening at 1 when the whole of the festival starts. So please go and check it out, and you will not only listen to the pieces, but listen to the musicians, hear their stories about these pieces. And this really was about, because Sónar, the festival, has always been exploring and scanning the musical cultures of the planet, thinking about what else was there to explore, and how actually one can think about exploration today in different terms. And the idea of thinking not only in other scales of space, not thinking about distances in the planetary scale of the planet, but in longer distances, also implies explorations in time, not thinking about time in the units of time that we normally use, which is the units of times of our lives, of these around 80-year chunks of times that we are given as human beings, but also in other time scales, the time scales of the universe, for instance, which are obviously measured in thousands of years. And because this project ideally is going to be 25 years long, and because the history of the festival is also another 25 years, it was a good moment to think about how do we learn to think in other scales of time, and how do we learn to think about problems in different scales of time. And if there's ever been a pioneering organization thinking about these problems, is the Long Now Foundation. It started more than 20 years ago, right? So actually around the same time, mid-90s. Started by some of the most interesting minds connected with digital culture, from who is really, I can say in many ways, the father or the foundational figure of digital culture, Stewart Brand, to pioneers of Silicon Valley like Danny Hillis, to another good friend of the festival, Mr. Brian Eno, who has been here in the last couple of years. So we actually wrote to them. I have to confess I didn't have a lot of hopes that they would be able to make it, but they were enthusiastic about making it. So I am very, very thankful that Alexander Rose, the president of the Long Now Foundation, is here today to talk about explorations in times. Sander, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The Long Now Foundation got started with a story. It was a story that was originally told by Gregory Bateson to Stewart Brand, and it was about the beams at New College, Oxford. And New College was built in the 1200s, and it had these large oak beams over the main hall. And 500 years later, in the 1800s, they realized that these beams needed to be replaced. And they also realized that you couldn't get lumber like this anymore very easily in Europe. And they didn't quite know what to do until they spoke to the school forester, who said, oh, well, we have the trees that you planted. And it turned out that 500 years before, when they built that building, they also planted a grove of oak trees to be harvested for these beams. And Stewart recounted this same story to a friend of his, Danny Hillis, who was building some of the fastest supercomputers in the world. And they realized that fundamentally there's just not this kind of thinking that's going on anymore. So the idea that you could put some acorns in the ground and pay attention to them for 500 years and solve an intractable problem 5 centuries into the future, it's both a very low effort thing, but it also solves a problem that could only be solved with that level of forethought. And so Danny wanted to take a break from building some of the fastest supercomputers in the world and actually see if he could build the slowest computer in the world as an icon to long-term thinking. This idea of a clock that would tick once a year and bong once a century, and a cuckoo would come out once a millennium. And Stewart was interested in that, but he also wanted there to be some content behind this kind of iconic object to get people to think longer term. And he had this idea of a library that could last on the same millennial timescale. And as was mentioned, Brian Eno is also one of the founders of the Long Now. And he actually coined this term long now when he first moved from Europe to New York. And he realized when people said now in New York, they meant a very different thing than what they meant in Europe. In that they really just meant the 5 minutes that they were in, so this kind of very short now. And so he said that he really wanted to live in this much longer now and a much bigger here than that. And this larger group, the people like Kevin Kelly, the founding editor at Wired, and all of these people who had really been, in a way, part of the accelerating of culture coming out of Silicon Valley, I think they were sensing this early in the 90s, that there was some kind of balancing corrective was needed. And if we are going to try and solve problems that are large in scope, things like hunger or climate change, none of these problems can be solved quickly. If somebody asked you to solve hunger in 4 years, you would say that they're crazy. But if you said, could you solve hunger in 400 years, you could imagine how you might start a project like that and lay the groundwork for doing it. And so we decided to embark on this idea of building the clock, this notional clock, originally this kind of poetic version of the clock that Danny talked about. But really, what kind of time scale did we want to work in? If you start working in astronomic time scales, you're working in these kind of billions of years that it's very difficult to find kind of relevance for humans. Or even geologic time scales are similar in that it's just dwarfing to the human experience. But if you really look at the last 10,000 years, this is when agriculture started, when cities started, and you have this moment, this human moment. But instead of thinking of ourselves as at the end of a 10,000-year story, thinking of ourselves in the middle of a 20,000-year story. And how would you act differently if that's how you were thinking about the future? And one of the very first parts of this project that I worked on with Stewart Brand and Brian Eno, actually, it came out of a long conversation of kind of how do you tease apart the different layers of human time? And you have the fastest ones on the outside, the most chaotic, going down through to the slowest ones, and nature being at the very bottom. And you can see how that this is a diagram. It's not terribly accurate, but the idea that if you start doing things up here on the commercial layer, like harvesting old-growth redwoods, and you're selling them up here on the commercial layer, but you've now taken a whole multi-thousand-year thing out of nature and skipped all the parts in between. And that's where you start to see problems in the culture, where they're kind of skipping over some of these shearing layers. So as we were trying to tease these things apart, I also started working very closely with Danny Hillis on building the very first prototype of a 10,000-year clock. And it went from a very notional project to a very specific and real project. The research that I started doing very early on is kind of trying to find a millennial precedent, some kind of objects that either have lasted accidentally or purposefully over the kind of timescales that we're going to be working with in the clock. And so I'm going to talk about a few examples of those, and then I'm going to show you some very specific examples of some of the design problems that we're solving, and then now the construction that the clock is under. One of the first objects that I came across is this amazing artifact, the Antikytheros device, which was found in a dive site off of Antikytheros, Greece. It was not understood what it was for a long time, but more recently, as they've taken X-rays and even MRIs of this object, they've been able to recreate it, and they've found that fundamentally it was an astronomical clock, or at least an astronomical prediction device. And not only did it set back the dates for things like differential gearing by a lot, as well as some knowledge of astronomical phenomena. It's a 2,000-year-old device, but it also shows that if you're lost and then you're found and you have a mechanical object instead of an all-electronic object, the idea that it can actually be reconstructed and understood. If this was a laptop that was at the bottom of the ocean for 2,000 years, it would be very difficult to understand the intent of what that object is, whereas a mechanical object, it takes very small visual cues in order to figure that out. Another strategy that seems to work over time, usually by accident, is this idea of sacrifice, a kind of ablative layer. And in nature, we see it with a lizard's tail that allows the lizard to live even after it's been attacked by a bird. But we also see accidental versions of this, like the outer casing stones of the pyramids in Egypt were all stolen, but fundamentally we still have the pyramids themselves. There's the hallways of the Taj Mahal were lined with jewels. Those jewels were pried out, but instead of destroying the whole building, a lot of time was spent extracting what people thought was the value of this building. But fundamentally, the value of the building to culture is really just the architecture in the building itself. So this kind of idea of putting a high-value layer that can be peeled away and still allows you to keep the thing that you're trying to save. You can also make things extremely remote. And remote, I think, offers two parts, which one is that it kind of increases the artifacts or the architecture's mythic stance, that you kind of know that it's there, it's far away, you have to travel to go see it. This is the picture of the seed vault at Svalbard. I visited a few years ago. This is what the airport looks like as you're flying into Svalbard. And what was interesting to me is not only the design work that had gone into making a 1,000-year seed vault, but also as I signed my name, I was signing my name after Ban Ki-moon and Jimmy Carter, and it was an amazing set of people that had traveled to this very remote place. So there's kind of this mythic quality to being remote. Another interesting strategy that we see here in Europe is the idea of just building something very, very slow. So by the time you've finished it, it's already crossed the line of being an antique. And so one of the most dangerous times for anything to last for several hundred years or several thousand years is the 1 or 2 generations after the first builders. That's because it's when it's your grandparents' thing. It's not the cool kids' new thing. But once it crosses over that, it starts to become a much more valued object. And we see that even here in Barcelona, where the Sagrada Familia is already a UNESCO World Heritage Site, even though it's not even complete in terms of construction and probably has another 100 years of construction, as near as I can tell. You can also make things last for a very long time just by maintaining them very well. We see many good examples of this in Japan. There's Shinto shrines that are rebuilt next to each other in exact copies every 20 years or 40 years or 60 years. Some of those go back over 1,600 years. These are two of the oldest continuously standing wooden structures in the world at over 1,400 years, and they were just very well maintained. The roofs were kept on, and we still have, they've maintained the outsides of them, but really the core structure has not changed for over 1,400 years. One curious thing that kept coming up as I started visiting sites around the world is that what people always try and stop when they're trying to make something that's going to last for a long time, especially in architecture, is water. And this is a picture of the outside of the Mormon genealogical vaults in Salt Lake City. And inside those vaults are these small drawers of microfiche of genealogical data. But what's interesting is that that vault has flooded 4 times already in its history. And they just, this picture also is not a picture of that, but the picture of the seed vault in Svalbard, which also has started flooding. And so often what people try and do is they try and keep water out of these structures. And the reality is the only thing that you get to do with water is divert water. You can choose where it's going to go in terms of direction, but you're never going to keep it out over these kind of timescales, especially when you're working underground. And the other kind of multi-millennial structures that we see getting built now are nuclear waste repositories. We have a 10,000-year design life one in the United States, and then there's 2 being built here in Europe that are over 100,000 years of design life. This is the one on Kalo, north of Helsinki in Finland. The last one I'll mention is this idea of ideology. It's one of the most dangerous parts of trying to do something on this time scale, is that at some point someone may decide that the thing that you're building conflicts with their ideology. This is a before and after picture of the Buddha's Bamiyan in Afghanistan, and you can see the Taliban bombed and blew apart these massive Buddhas just because it conflicted with their ideology. And a Buddha is a pretty innocuous symbol in terms of as far as religions go, but it was threatening enough that it was worth their time to destroy it. As I mentioned, Stewart Brand had thought that if we were going to have an icon to long-term thinking, that we still had to have an information component. How does civilization remember the things it does right and the things it does wrong and pass on information? And we wanted to kind of put a stake in the ground around this idea of a 10,000-year library. And we took inspiration originally from the Rosetta Stone, because we felt that right now we're starting to archive things in digital media and many different languages, and there's no way that you're ever going to preserve all of those languages going forward, but what you do need is a kind of a linguistic key that would allow anything that does survive to be read. But instead of just 2 languages and 3 scripts, we started micro-etching using a gallium ion beam, thousands and thousands of pages of linguistic data down onto this disk. It was only a couple inches in diameter. One of those was launched on the European Space Agency's Rosetta mission, and it's on the orbiter that was just recently landed down onto the comet. So that's going to continue orbiting the sun along with that orbiter and the comet for hopefully thousands, if not millions of years. So we have one of them there, and then we have several of them down here on Earth in archives around the world, and they have basically the kind of about 10 different elements in over 2,000 languages, so a parallel text, a bit of information about where that language is spoken, a map, things like that. So this gives you a way into thousands of different languages around the world. The clock project that I mentioned earlier, we started with building a prototype that's at the Science Museum in London now. We have a few prototypes at our offices in San Francisco. And now we're finally building it at the monument scale, the scale that allows you to actually kind of walk through the workings of the clock. But I just wanted to give you a quick glimpse into what the types of problems that we solve when we're working on a 10,000-year clock. So there's a lot of ways the Long Now Foundation could have tried to inspire long-term thinking. We could release white papers, and we could have conferences, and we do some of those things. But fundamentally, as soon as you are really building a real object, you have to ask yourself very fundamental questions. Is this clock going to be wound by people? Are the hands of people going to look and feel the same way that they do now in 10,000 years? What is the aesthetic that you should make a 10,000-year object in that will keep it compelling for 10,000 years? And of course, we don't know all the answers to these questions, but these are the kind of questions that you're faced with as soon as you start actually building this object. This is the analemma. This is a picture of the sun throughout the course of a year. It's a multiple exposure. The solstice is at the top and bottom, and the equinox where they cross over. This became a relevant problem for us in that we wanted the clock to be able to keep both absolute time, so a ticking pendulum, as well as be synchronized to the sun on any sunny day. So we focus sunlight on this tank of air, and a metal bellows expands, and we get this synchronization event of solar noon. But if you synchronize solar noon to absolute noon, you actually could be synchronizing them wrong by about 15 minutes, depending on where you are on the year. And so we could have adjusted for this with a two-dimensional cam that has this equation in it. But the Earth is precessing on its axis every 26,000 years. And it's slowing its rotational rate right now by about a second a century. So in order to account for all of that, what you actually need is this three-dimensional cam that has a follower that reads it once a year but goes up and gets that equation as it evolves over 10,000 years. So this one object basically gives you the difference between solar time and absolute time over 10,000 years. So this is the type of thing that we had to solve as we were building this clock. And now we're working at this monument scale, and we were fortunate enough to get sponsored by Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, who's very interested in long-term thinking. It was one of the main focuses when he published, when Amazon went public. He published a letter that said it's all about the long term. And he became very interested in working with us on this, and was getting this property in western Texas, mostly for launching spacecraft, but it had this amazing mountain range in it, and we chose to start working there. And we started with some of the oldest technology of moving through rock, which was blasting. And we wanted the experience of going to the clock to be this remote site, kind of like Svalbard, where if you're going to go visit it, you're going to have to take the time, pick a group of people, you're going to travel with them, you're going to be talking about why you're going there, and then you're going to arrive there, and we wanted it to be this kind of rough-hewn entrance, and then you'd move through the whole clock experience to a much more refined part, and then you exit. And the problem was there really wasn't a lot of good technology for working underground in the way we wanted to. We wanted to be able to cut steps and three-dimensional underground spaces with kind of robotic precision, but those robots didn't exist. There was these saws that were used in Carrara, Italy, these diamond belt saws. And we devised a way, working with this group in Seattle, to basically turn these saws that are normally used for just cutting squares to be a multi-axis robot. So this is a 9-foot diamond chainsaw, basically, with a 30,000-pound robot attached to it. And then we were able to go ahead and build that and suspend it underground. And it can cut pretty darn fast, but it still took over 2 years to cut 300 vertical feet of underground stairs. And this became the space that the clock was going to hang in, and the stairs allow people to walk up through the whole space and visit the clock. And the stairs themselves are tapering over the course of those 300 feet. So every single cut that the saw made was a different cut. And that part of the project is just wrapped up recently, and now we're starting to finally install the workings of the clock itself. And this clock works very similarly to most clocks, with a few exceptions. You know, it has a power system where it stores power in a weight. That power can come both from the people that wind it, the visitors themselves, as well as the temperature difference from day to night. So that same mechanism I mentioned that can synchronize the clock to solar noon also feeds energy into keeping it wound. And the power system of the clock and the chime generator are the two first parts of the clock that we've completed and have started to install. This first prototype of the chime system is at our offices in San Francisco now. This chime system was worked out with one of our co-founders, Brian Eno, as a way of ringing 10 bells in a different sequence each day for 10,000 years. So over 3.5 million permutations of bell ringing. And Brian released an album of various permutations of these bells. And once we had that first version of it made physically, we now had to make it much larger. This thing that's kind of large enough in scale that you can walk through the workings of it as a kind of a monument. And we had the underground space that you've seen, but now we're starting to build in the final materials of stainless steel and ceramic and titanium. Each bell station is hung like this, like a giant mobile, and this is a video that we just made a couple weeks ago of the energy system for that getting tested. The parts that are now going in underground include the complete power system, and as I mentioned, people do wind it, and we wanted the clock to have this input from people, not just ignore people and not be only self-wound. So the clock keeps time all by itself, so it knows what time it is, but it doesn't show you the time unless you feed energy into it. So it's keeping track of now, and when you arrive, it shows you the time of the last people who visited it, and you wind it, and then it brings those two things into one point, and you then see how long it's been since the last people have visited as well. So we then had to work at this kind of scale for the power system, and there was one part of the clock that was the most difficult engineering problem starting out, and it was how to make bearings that could last for 10,000 years, something that can allow two things to roll on each other for over 10,000 years. Normal, even stainless steel bearings would actually weld themselves shut over this kind of time scale. And when I started this project, there was the right solution. It was over 20 years ago, and they had just really started using these all-ceramic bearings for satellites and spacecraft. And the problem was those bearings cost about $50,000 each, and didn't seem feasible for us to use them. But now they're in fidget spinners and rollerblades and cost $5 each. So pretty much every single bearing throughout the clock is this near diamond hard industrial ceramic bearing that allows us to keep these elements rolling. It also does a thing where it separates the different metals so that they don't oxidize. And the power system was prototyped at our shops near San Francisco, and is now being installed underground in West Texas. The work environment is pretty interesting. It's a 500-foot deep hole that requires a lot of infrastructure in order just to work there, 400 steps that all the workers go down, and a sequence where we're building it kind of like a ship in a bottle. We're building from the bottom up, and we can only kind of build it in this sequence, and we can't undo it. So all of the stuff that we're putting in, we have to complete in a pretty rigorous sequence and in a pretty remote environment. So it's kind of akin to building a telescope on a remote mountain environment at this point. And this is the winder that people will walk around in order to wind the clock, and the weight that is about 15,000 pounds that stores the energy for the clock. And these are the pictures of that just got installed literally about a month ago. And this is the engineers winding the clock for the very first time. It would probably take about 8 hours to wind the clock all the way up, and that power would last the clock for almost a century if it was needed. And I'm going to end with that, and I know that we have some questions either with Jose, or we can, if any of you have questions, we can just take them now. How do you want to do questions? Okay, you have questions. All right.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexander, for this fascinating survey of your work. I wanted to open up to everybody, but actually I had a few questions in terms of the scope of the project or what it involves. In a certain way, it feels like you're actually a cathedral builder. You know, you are facing some of the challenges that, as you were putting with cathedral builders were doing, but cathedrals were obviously symbols and spaces that were kind of the foundations of a whole spiritual approach to life. What is actually in a way, the spiritual foundations or intellectual or convivial dimensions that the clock wants to represent? It's like the clock is a symbol for what, in a way?
Well, I mean, there is an ideology, and it is this idea of long-term thinking, that there are spaces where long-term thinking is valuable and good and is worth doing. But we've also tried to be very careful not to make it highly prescriptive and tell people what to think about that. So what we really want people to do is to encounter it and reflect and take this whole trip out there, do it, and return home. And whatever they want to take away from that is really up to them. I think we've learned that fundamentally you can't tell people to think long term. You have to kind of give them provocative ideas and experiences, and then they can walk away from that and interpret that however that they want. And I think the real question for us is like, how do you do that with an experience? And how do you create a transformational experience? And the main design criteria that we used as we were working through this is if we dug into the mountain and we found the clock already there, what do we wish we had found?
Some of the symbols that you presented as examples of operating also in other scales of time, like the Buddhas in Afghanistan or in the global seed bank, in a way also show the fragility of an enterprise like this. The Buddhas have disappeared. We know that last year, recently, the global seed bank suffered a flooding, and this was almost kind of like a symbol of we are building this institution for the very long resilience in case that we need it, and actually we are showing how fragile it is. So how do you, in a way, imagine that this fragility it's also part of your enterprise, and how do you actually, in a way, incorporate resilience in the notion that we have to also, in a way, design or build for the unexpected or unpredictable, I imagine?
Yeah, and I think that by far the greatest danger to the clock is humans themselves, and somebody coming to take the metal for something else, right? So turning the clock site into a mine. But there's a lot of engineering challenges in trying to build a 10,000-year object. But I think the real challenge is how do you build a 10,000-year institution that keeps it relevant and has interesting provocations around that, that also protects this object, and how do you make it something that people want to protect? And we don't know if we've done that yet, but that's going to be the enterprise of the Long Now Foundation after the clock is built.
Of course, you've been working in the clock for a long time, although in the context of the Long Now Foundation, not such a long time, yep. or long is a relative term. What other artifacts or what other endeavors the Long Time Foundation envisions to start, especially as the project of the Long Now, which has been very central to its existence, gets closer to completion?
Yeah, I mean, we're crossing a kind of an interesting time that, by the time we're about 25 years old, the age of this conference, yeah. we will have finished this very experimental phase, and we're going to move into a phase where, this very notional, perfect object that we've talked about is now going to be real and in the world and criticizable, and so moving forward, it's going to be a very different institution, I think, than it has been up to now. Some of the projects I mentioned, like the Rosetta Project, have been interesting for us to kind of test the waters in information that can last on this timescale. We've also started a small library at our space in San Francisco called the Manual for Civilization. So it's the 3,000 books you would most want to restart civilization, and that's becoming both a digital and a physical collection that we're storing at that site, as well as on the Internet Archive for public, for the rest of the world to actually be able to check out these books. But it's a crowd-curated collection of these 3,000 books across multiple subjects, not just how to build things, but also classics of literature and things like that.
There's actually also this paradox that's been discussed many times that against where we could think that digital preservation is a much harder problem than physical preservation, that it's easier to keep objects around than bits. In which way the Long Now Foundation thinks also in terms of its digital legacy, or actually how do we do long-term preservation in the digital sphere?
Yeah, well, the digital preservation problem is a really interesting one, and there's been, the very early digital history is basically already lost. There was so little standardization, and so many companies went out of business that the formats we've really already lost most of that information. And there's now, because of the web and how cheap it is to store things, we now mostly are storing the bits and we're able to distribute them a little bit better than we used to. But we're still losing the interpretation of those all the time. And the problems of versioning of software, and you think about CAD drawings of important artifacts that are in the world, how those CAD drawings are going to be reinterpreted by software over years. I can't imagine that that's going to be a trouble-free process. And so, we took a bit of a stand when making the Rosetta disk, to use a very analog technology that you can put this thing under a microscope and you can read it. But then, of course, it has many limitations. You can't have relational databases and music and all of these things represented very well with just visuals.
Just one last question before opening to everybody. I imagine that, especially in the beginnings, the Long Now Foundation found a lot of skepticism and resistance to its mission, but it feels also that in these 25 years, a lot of things have changed in how do we relate or think about long scales of time. The notion of the Anthropocene, the idea that the planet has entered into another geological age, has popularized and had a big impact in philosophy, in politics. Climate change as a challenge has started helping us to think in wider terms, and even the Paris Agreement itself is basically an 80-year-long commitment. It's asking us to do something today for the benefit of people of 2100, 80 years from now. So do you feel in a way, or does the Foundation feel a little bit vindicated in terms of what was his thinking in the 90s, and how actually does it relate to the kind of long-term thinking that we are finding today, and that actually is very problematic from the perspective of politics, because we still don't have long-term political institutions that work very effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there was a very interesting thing that happened before the turn of the millennium, where people, and this was one of the driving forces behind Danny Hillis's thinking, is that when he was a kid in the 60s, the future was the year 2000, and then there we were in like 1998, and the future was still the year 2000. It was very difficult for people to look past that moment of the millennium, and it became this kind of threshold. And so when we were working on this project before the turn of the millennium, there was a lot of interest in it just because there were so many people doing these year 2000 projects, and we were kind of lumped into that. And then year 2000 happened, and basically there was almost no interest, and it was this very odd time. And I think there was a kind of a temporal vertigo that people were having of this, like, oh, well, we've lost our future now. That future point is gone. The next stopping point is what? Is it 2100? Is it 2010? Is it the year 3000? And so there was a lot of kind of, I think, uneasiness, and you could see it. I mean, the world markets crashed. I mean, it was an interesting time, I think, in general. And then as we've kind of come into figuring out what our future is, and as we're also faced with some of these issues of climate change or an asteroid impact or some of these things that are, kind of existential for civilization, and also require a certain amount of long-term thinking. And everyone is now realizing that you do have to take that kind of big gesture and make a very long-term project in order to solve them.
So the mic is open for anyone who wants to actually have a question or have something to say. We have what's over there.
Is anybody at the foundation looking at the neuroscience of time perception and how we might modulate it, maybe, or at least understand what the kind of limits are, and how you might play with that?
Yeah, one of our board members is David Eagleman, who's a neuroscientist who studies specifically time in the brain. And as you might imagine, the earliest examples of humanity, and anybody who's a subsistence farmer or somebody who's really working hand to mouth with their environment, it's very difficult for them to think very long term. And so in order to think long term, you kind of have to have a lot of the basics covered. So I think there's a question of when is it right for humanity to be thinking on these timescales. But you could also, now that we, in general, as a planet, have the basics taken care of, the idea that, for instance, we have a space program, but we don't have a good defense mechanism for asteroids or comets that could take out all of humanity is very odd. Like we're playing around in space, but you would think that the very first thing that we would do is try and take care of this truly existential threat that we know is coming. And so there's clearly this kind of neuro disconnect between what's worth it for me to spend time on that will benefit humanity or some of these much more short-term things. And there is a lot of research in this area. It's not being solved, but you're up against millions of years of evolution that in the human brain that it just says you need to be able to take care of eating and sleeping and some of these basic instincts. And how do you overcome that is not yet known.
Another one here.
Thanks for the presentation. I find quite interesting that when you approach this idea of 10,000 years, you come back to this idea of a material object that feels quite, it's one of a kind, it's material, it's placed in a precise place, and you addressed the concerns about how to protect this object in the long term. I'm wondering if at the foundation you approach, or you have other approach that are more linked to the digital, in the age of internet, what is the approach of thinking in 10,000 years? If it's something that has to be material and it has to be placed in one location with the risk of being destroyed, or if it's something that it has to be immaterial, that is information-based, and that has to be actually in a lot of nodes distributed in a lot of places, so actually it makes it much more difficult. It's the risk that it disappears at some point. It's it's less. No? It's much more safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the truly, multi-millennial artifacts we have in civilization are stories. So, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, 8,000 years old, and some very, very old stories. And so, really, what we're trying to do is build a story. And the clock is really this kind of mechanism by which a myth can hopefully get created. And if the clock lasts, that would be great. But I think if it creates enough of a story and a myth, that could probably outlast the clock by thousands of years. So but I don't know. I think that our question was, how do you create something that's worth telling a story about, right? So it's an interesting question. And one way is to do this kind of large-scale project. I think there's many other ways to do it effectively. I think one of my favorite ideas that it was Penn from Penn & Teller suggested that really what we should do is just make a documentary about making the clock and hiding it, but never actually do it. And that way people will always be looking for this mythical clock that they don't know where it is.
Last question. Oh, one. Last one. No, sorry. Last one, super fast. We're running out of time. Yeah.
Alexander, thanks. I'm curious at the long now, is there a sort of consensus pessimism or optimism that the biologic us, the humans of today, will even exist 10,000 years from now?
Well, we don't have an official stance on whether that's going to be the case or not. But I think, as I mentioned, when we start actually building this thing, we were confronted with this idea of, our hand's going to be the same shape to wind this? Are people going to be the same height, roughly? Are people going to be corporeal? And I think the reality is that we can't second guess that. What we decided to do was make something that was compelling now and had told as much about the people that built it as possible. So for instance, we didn't build it in the metric system, which was painful for me. It's built in the imperial measurement system, which is the worst measurement system ever, but it says the most about the particular culture that happened to have been built in. And so, as we try and take apart artifacts from the past, like the pyramids, we kind of wish we had these cues that we don't really have. And so we tried to build as much of that into it as possible.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't have time for that. I have good news, though. Alexander has another talk, and actually it's going to be more of a conversation at the Maker Faire, which, as you know, starts on Saturday after Sónar+D ends. It's on Saturday, right? So he will be on Saturday at the Maker Faire. So that's first notice. Two more notices of interest. One is, as I said, the Sonar calling control room, showcasing thing about this project of sending music to the exoplanet is opening at 1, and you can see it for the rest of the week starting at 1. And stick around because we've been talking about explorations of time. Now we're going to talk about explorations in space in the next session with SETI and NASA and the SETI Artist in Residence program. Thank you.
Thank you.
We ain't speaking for 5 months, so I'm nervous now. You said that you heard my last shit, so I know you're mad.